Alexandra Thornton was the kind of woman people wrote books about. At just 38 years old, she'd done what most people only dream of. She'd taken her father's small pharmaceutical company and turned it into something massive. Biogen Industries wasn't just successful. It was a giant in the medical world worth billions of dollars and employing thousands of people across the country. Everyone knew her name. Business magazines put her face on their covers. She gave speeches at conferences where people paid thousands just to hear her talk. Young entrepreneurs studied her strategies in business schools. When she walked into a room, conversations stopped. People wanted her attention, her approval, her time. But if you looked closely, really closely, you might have noticed something was wrong. The smile she wore in photos never quite reached her eyes. Her hands shook slightly when she thought no one was watching. And lately, she'd started wearing more makeup to hide the dark circles that no amount of expensive cream could fix. The truth was simple and terrible. Alexandra was dying from the inside out, and she'd been dying for years. Not from some sudden disease, but from the life she'd built for herself. A life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty on the inside. She worked 18 hours a day, sometimes 20. Her office became her home. Her employees became the closest thing she had to friends, though she knew they feared her more than they liked her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed at something genuinely funny, or the last time someone had hugged her just because. Her father had died 6 years ago, leaving her the company when she was barely 32. His last words to her were about the business. "Don't let them destroy what I built," he'd said, gripping her hand in the hospital. "Promise me you'll keep it strong," she'd promised. And she'd kept that promise with everything she had, sacrificing piece after piece of herself along the way. First went her hobbies, then her friendships, then any chance at a normal relationship. She'd dated a few times over the years, but no one could compete with the company. No one understood why she had to check her phone during dinner, why she couldn't take a real vacation, why she woke up at 4 in the morning with her mind already racing through problems and solutions. To stay awake through the endless meetings and late nights, she started taking pills. Just prescription stimulants at first, from her own company's product line. Nothing illegal, nothing that seemed dangerous, just a little help to keep going. Then she added something to help her sleep when her mind wouldn't shut off. Then something else to manage the anxiety that started creeping in during her rare quiet moments. She told herself it was under control. She was a pharmaceutical executive after all. She understood medicine better than most people. She knew what she was doing, except she didn't. The collapse happened on a Tuesday afternoon during the quarterly shareholder meeting. Alexandra was presenting the annual report to a room full of investors and board members. She'd given this presentation dozens of times before. She knew every number, every projection, every carefully crafted phrase designed to inspire confidence. She was halfway through a slide about projected growth when the room started to tilt. At first, she thought it was just the lights. They seemed too bright suddenly, almost blinding. Then her hands started tingling. The paper she was holding fell to the floor, and she couldn't seem to make her fingers pick them up. Someone in the front row stood up, concerned. She heard her name being called, but it sounded like it was coming from underwater, distant and distorted. Her chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing her lungs. She tried to take a breath, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The last thing she remembered was the cold marble floor rushing up to meet her, and the sound of chairs scraping as people jumped to their feet. When she woke up, she was in a hospital bed surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed. A doctor she didn't recognize was standing over her, looking serious. Behind him, she could see her assistant through the glass window, talking urgently on her phone. The doctor explained it all in calm, professional terms. Her liver was failing. Years of medication, stress, and ignoring her body's warning signs had pushed it past the breaking point. She also had an autoimmune disease that she'd apparently been living with for years without knowing it. The combination was deadly. "How long do I have?" she asked, her voice rough and unfamiliar. The doctor hesitated. That hesitation told her everything she needed to know. Without a transplant, maybe 3 to 6 months. But getting a transplant is complicated. You'd need to be healthy enough to survive the surgery, and right now your body isn't strong enough. We need to stabilize you first, and even then there are no guarantees. 3 to 6 months. Half a year. Maybe less. She'd built a billion-dollar empire, but she couldn't buy more time. The news leaked within 48 hours. Of course it did. In the corporate world, secrets like this never stayed hidden for long. The business news networks ran segments analyzing what her illness meant for the company's stock price. Competitors started circling, smelling blood in the water. Her board of directors held an emergency meeting. They came to visit her once, a delegation of 3 senior members wearing their concerned faces. They talked about succession planning and interim leadership and maintaining investor confidence. They didn't ask how she was feeling. They didn't hold her hand or tell her they hoped she'd recover. They treated her like a problem that needed to be solved, a risk that needed to be managed. After they left, she overheard 2 nurses talking in the hallway. They were discussing the news coverage, how someone so young and successful could end up in this situation. One of them said it was sad but not surprising. "These CEO types," the nurse had said, "they think they're invincible until they're not." Alexandra stared at the ceiling of her hospital room and realized the nurse was right. She'd thought she was invincible. She'd thought she could push her body and mind indefinitely. That success was worth any price. She'd believed that building something impressive was the same as building something meaningful. Family members she hadn't heard from in years suddenly started calling. Distant cousins, her father's business partners, people who'd never had time for her when she was healthy, but now seemed very interested in her well-being. She knew what they really wanted. They wanted to know about the will, about the inheritance, about who would control the company. She stopped answering the phone. At night, alone in her private hospital suite, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd done to herself. She'd built an empire of medicine, a company that saved lives while slowly destroying her own life. The irony was almost funny. Almost she had money, power, and respect. But she had no one who loved her. No one who would sit beside her bed just to keep her company. No one who would miss her as a person, rather than as an economic force. For the first time since her father's death, Alexandra Thornton cried. Not quiet, dignified tears, but deep, broken sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the life she'd wasted, for the connections she'd never made, for the love she'd never allowed herself to find. She cried because she was finally ready to admit the truth. She was dying, and she was dying completely, utterly alone. James Caldwell had never imagined his life would turn out this way. When he was 18 and signing up for the Army, he'd pictured a straightforward path. Serve his country, come home, maybe become a firefighter or a police officer, something that mattered, something that helped people. Instead, he'd gotten 2 tours in Iraq, a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer and never looked at, and a traumatic brain injury that ended his military career before he turned 27. He'd also gotten nightmares that woke him up at 3 in the morning, a constant ringing in his ears, and the kind of memories that made it hard to be in crowded places. But the worst part, the part that actually broke him, was coming home to find his wife packing her bags. She'd been honest about it at least. "I can't do this anymore, James. You're not the man I married. I don't know who you are now." She'd left him with divorce papers and a 3-year-old son named Tyler who barely recognized his own father. James had been deployed for most of Tyler's life. He was essentially a stranger in his own child's eyes. The custody battle had been brutal. His ex-wife's lawyer had painted him as unstable, possibly dangerous. They'd brought up his PTSD, his medical discharge, the fact that he sometimes forgot simple things because of his brain injury. The judge had been sympathetic but cautious. His ex-wife got full custody. James got supervised visitation every other weekend. That had been 5 years ago. 5 years of fighting to prove he was capable of being a good father. 5 years of therapy appointments, medical evaluations, and court hearings. 5 years of working whatever jobs he could find while going to school at night to become a nurse. He'd chosen nursing because of his time as an Army medic. In the chaos of combat, he'd discovered he was good at staying calm when everyone else was panicking. He was good at keeping people alive when things looked hopeless. And he was good at treating people with dignity even in their worst moments. Now 33 years old, James worked as a private care nurse. He specialized in the difficult cases, the patients that other nurses couldn't handle. The angry ones, the demanding ones, the ones who'd given up and didn't want help. He had the patience for it. Maybe because he understood what it felt like to be broken and angry and scared. The pay was decent, enough to afford a small 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that wasn't great, but wasn't terrible. 1 bedroom for him, 1 for Tyler on the weekends he got to visit. He'd fought hard for unsupervised visits, and 6 months ago a judge had finally agreed. Those weekends with Tyler were everything to him. His son was 8 now, curious about everything, full of energy and questions. He loved dinosaurs and space and building things with his hands. Every other Friday, when James picked him up from his ex-wife's house, Tyler would run to the car with a backpack full of toys and stories about school. Those were the moments James lived for. Money was always tight, though. The legal fees never seemed to end. Every time he thought he was caught up, something else would come up. Tyler needed new shoes because his feet were growing faster than James could keep up with. The car needed repairs. The rent was going up, and his lawyer was pushing for another custody hearing, one that might finally get James joint custody instead of just every other weekend. That hearing would cost $5,000. James had been saving for months and had barely scraped together half of that. So when the call came from Biogen Industries' Human Resources Department, he'd almost ignored it. Taking care of rich people in their fancy homes wasn't why he'd become a nurse. But the woman on the phone had been persistent. "We have a patient who needs specialized care," she'd explained. "Someone with complex medical needs and a difficult personality. We've gone through 4 nurses in 3 weeks. We're willing to pay triple your normal rate for a 3-month assignment." Triple his rate. James had done the math in his head. 3 months of that salary would cover the custody hearing, Tyler's expenses, and leave him with a cushion for the first time in years. "What's wrong with the patient?" he'd asked. There'd been a pause. "She's dying. Liver failure. She's resistant to treatment and has refused to cooperate with her medical team. We need someone who won't quit after a few days of verbal abuse." James had dealt with dying soldiers who lashed out in pain and fear. He'd talked suicidal veterans through their darkest moments. A hostile billionaire didn't scare him. "I'll take the case," he'd said. The following Monday, James reported to the private hospital wing where Alexandra Thornton had been transferred. The facility was unlike anything he'd seen before. It looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. Marble floors, original artwork on the walls, and staff who spoke in hushed, respectful tones. A doctor briefed him before he met Alexandra. Advanced liver failure, autoimmune complications, refusal to comply with treatment protocols. She'd fired 2 therapists, refused to see a nutritionist, and had thrown a water pitcher at the last nurse who'd tried to help her with physical therapy. "She's given up," the doctor had said bluntly. "We're doing everything we can medically, but if she won't participate in her own care, there's not much hope. We need someone who can get through to her." James had nodded, taking it all in. He'd seen that look before, that giving up. It was in the eyes of soldiers who'd decided they were done fighting. When he walked into Alexandra's private suite, he found her sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the city below. She didn't turn around when he entered. The room was silent except for the soft beeping of monitoring equipment. "I don't need another nurse," she said, her voice flat. "You can leave." James set his bag down and pulled up a chair. "Not how this works. I'm here for 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. You're stuck with me." She turned to look at him then, and he got his first real look at her face. She was younger than he'd expected, probably not even 40, but she looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. Her skin had a yellowish tint from the liver failure. Her eyes were hard and empty. "They're paying you a lot of money to babysit me while I die," she said. "Must be nice." "Actually, yeah, the money's good," James replied honestly. "I need it for a custody hearing. Fighting to get more time with my son." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe at his honesty. "So you're just here for the paycheck," she said. "Partially, but I'm also here because I'm good at my job, and my job is keeping you alive and as comfortable as possible." "What if I don't want to be kept alive?" James leaned back in his chair, considering her carefully. "Then that's your choice. But you're going to have to make that choice while being properly fed, medicated, and mobile. If you're going to give up, you're going to do it while in the best possible health." Sounds contradictory, I know, but that's the deal. Alexandra stared at him for a long moment. "You're different from the others. Army medic before I was a nurse. I learned to deal with difficult patients in difficult situations. You're not the first person who's tried to push me away. And yet you're still here." "And yet I'm still here," James agreed. Over the next few days, they established an uneasy routine. Alexandra resisted everything. She refused meals, ignored her medication schedule, and declined physical therapy. But James was relentlessly patient. When she wouldn't eat, he'd sit beside her bed and eat the meal himself, describing every bite until her stomach growled, and she grudgingly accepted a few bites. When she pretended to take her medications and then hid them under her pillow, he waited until she fell asleep and checked. He didn't scold her or lecture her. He just made a note in her chart and tried again the next time. She tested him constantly, trying to find his breaking point. She was rude, dismissive, and sometimes cruel. She made comments about him being just a nurse, just hired help, just someone doing a job for money. James let it roll off him. He'd heard worse from wounded soldiers who were scared and in pain. He knew that anger was often just fear in disguise. One afternoon, about a week into his assignment, his babysitter canceled at the last minute. James's ex-wife was out of town and he had no backup. He called his supervisor, explaining the situation. "I can bring my son with me," he'd offered. "He's 8, very well behaved. He can sit in the waiting area." There'd been hesitation, but given Alexandra's high-profile status and the difficulty of finding replacement nurses, they'd agreed. Tyler had been excited about visiting his dad at work. James had packed his backpack with books, colored pencils, and his favorite action figures. "You need to be quiet and respectful," James had told him. "This is a hospital and people here are sick. I'll be good, Dad, I promise." But Tyler was 8, and 8-year-olds have energy that can't always be contained. Within an hour of arriving, he'd gotten bored with coloring and had wandered down the hallway. Curious about the fancy building, James found him standing in the doorway of Alexandra's room, staring wide-eyed at all the medical equipment. "Tyler, what did I tell you about staying in the waiting room?" James said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "I'm sorry, Dad, but look at all this stuff. What does this machine do? And that one?" James was about to usher him out when Alexandra spoke for the first time that day. "That one monitors my heart rate," she said quietly, pointing to one of the machines. "And that one tracks my oxygen levels." Tyler walked closer, fascinated. "Why do you need them?" "Because I'm sick. My body isn't working right anymore. My dad can fix you. He fixes everyone." Alexandra's expression softened slightly. "I don't think I'm fixable, kiddo. That's what my dad says people told him when he came home from the army, but he got better. Maybe you can too." James stood frozen in the doorway, watching this exchange. It was the most he'd heard Alexandra say at once since he'd started working with her. And for the first time since he'd met her, she wasn't looking at someone with anger or resentment. She was looking at his son with something that almost resembled curiosity. Tyler spent the next 20 minutes asking her questions about her illness, about the hospital, about what it felt like to be sick. He showed her his favorite toy, a small plastic astronaut that he carried everywhere. He told her about school, about his friends, about how he wanted to be a scientist when he grew up. Alexandra listened. Actually listened. When Tyler's energy finally wore down and he fell asleep in the chair beside her bed, she looked up at James. "He's a good kid." "He's everything to me," James said simply. "You're fighting for custody, fighting for more time with him, yeah. His mom has primary custody. I get every other weekend. That must be hard." It was the first personal thing she'd said to him, the first acknowledgement that he was a real person with his own struggles. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done," James admitted. "Harder than anything I faced in the army, but he's worth fighting for." Alexandra looked back at Tyler, sleeping peacefully with his toy astronaut clutched in his small hand. "Maybe we're not that different," she said softly. "We're both fighting battles that feel impossible to win." James didn't respond. He just pulled up a chair and sat down, keeping watch over both his patient and his sleeping son. Something had shifted in that room, some small crack in the armor Alexandra had built around herself. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. After Tyler's visit, something changed in Alexandra. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but James noticed it in small ways. She stopped hiding her medications under the pillow. She complained less when he brought her meals. She even asked when Tyler might visit again. "He has school during the week," James explained, adjusting her IV line. "But he'll be back this weekend if that's okay with you." Alexandra nodded, and James could swear he saw the faintest hint of a smile. The next few days fell into a new rhythm. Alexandra still wasn't easy to work with. She had moments where the anger and bitterness came flooding back, where she'd snap at James or refuse to cooperate. But those moments were becoming less frequent. More importantly, she was starting to actually participate in her own care. James learned things about her during those quiet hours in her hospital suite. Not from asking direct questions, which she hated, but from listening to her talk when she was ready. She'd mention something about her father, and James would nod and let her continue. She'd comment on a business problem, and he'd ask a simple question that would get her talking more. He learned that her father had built the pharmaceutical company from nothing, working 16-hour days and sacrificing time with his family. He learned that Alexandra had idolized him, following him to the office even as a child, learning the business before she'd learned algebra. He learned that when he died, she'd made a promise to preserve his legacy no matter what it cost. "I spent my whole life trying to make him proud," she said one afternoon, while James was checking her vitals. "Even now, with him gone, I'm still trying to prove I was worth his time." "Did he tell you that you needed to prove it?" James asked gently. Alexandra was quiet for a long moment. "No, he never said that. But he never said I didn't need to either." James understood that kind of thinking. He'd spent years trying to prove to himself and everyone else that he wasn't broken, that his brain injury and PTSD didn't define him. He'd pushed himself relentlessly to be a good father, a good nurse, a good man. Sometimes the hardest prison to escape was the one you built in your own mind. When Saturday came, Tyler arrived with his backpack full of treasures to show Alexandra. He'd brought a book about the human body that his teacher had lent him, and he was bursting with questions. "Miss Alexandra, did you know that the liver does over 500 different jobs in your body?" Tyler said, climbing into the chair beside her bed. "That's a lot of jobs for one organ." "I didn't know that," Alexandra said, even though she probably did. "What else did you learn?" Tyler launched into an enthusiastic explanation of everything he'd read, mispronouncing medical terms and mixing up some facts, but radiating pure excitement about learning. James watched as Alexandra listened patiently, occasionally correcting him gently or adding details. "You're really smart about this stuff," Tyler said admiringly. "Do you like science?" "I do, or I did. I haven't thought about it in a long time. I've been too busy running a company." "What's more important, running a company or doing science?" Alexandra looked at the 8-year-old, considering her with complete sincerity. "That's a really good question, Tyler. I used to think running the company was everything. Now I'm not so sure." James made sandwiches in the small kitchenette attached to Alexandra's suite, simple turkey and cheese that Tyler loved. He brought 3 plates over, and for the first time since he'd started working there, the 3 of them ate together like normal people instead of a nurse, a patient, and a visitor. Tyler chattered about school, about his friends, about the science fair coming up in 2 months. "I want to do something about medicine," he said. "Maybe how vaccines work or something." "Dad, will you help me?" "Of course I will, buddy. Miss Alexandra, would you help too?" Tyler asked innocently. James started to tell Tyler that Alexandra might not be available, but she spoke first. "I'd like that," she said. "If I'm able to, I'll help you with your project." The words hung in the air. "If I'm able to," it was the first time Alexandra had acknowledged that she might have a future beyond the next few weeks. After Tyler left that evening, exhausted and happy, Alexandra was unusually quiet. James tidied up the room, giving her space to think. "He believes I'm going to get better," Alexandra finally said. "He just assumes it. Kids see things simply sometimes. They don't understand all the complications. What if he's right, though? What if I am giving up too easily?" James sat down in the chair Tyler had occupied. "Only you can answer that. But I'll tell you what I learned in the army and dealing with my own stuff afterward. Giving up is easy. Living is hard. The question isn't whether you can survive. It's whether you want to." "I don't know anymore," Alexandra admitted. "I spent so long focused on the company, on proving myself, that I forgot what I was living for. Now that it might all be over, I realize I don't have anything else. No family that cares about me. No real friends. Just a company that'll replace me the second I'm gone." "That's not entirely true." "What do you mean?" "You have an 8-year-old kid who's excited about showing you his science fair project." "That's something." Alexandra laughed, a real laugh that surprised both of them. "I guess it is." Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. Alexandra started trying. Really trying. She worked with the physical therapist instead of refusing. She met with the nutritionist and actually followed the meal plans. She attended therapy sessions and talked about the grief and loneliness she'd been carrying for years. Her medical team was cautiously optimistic. Her liver function wasn't improving dramatically, but it had stabilized. More importantly, her overall health was getting better. She was stronger, more alert, more present. James brought Tyler to visit twice a week now. Alexandra had a nurse's station clear out a corner of her suite where Tyler could work on his science fair project. She ordered books and supplies, helped him understand complicated concepts, and listened to his endless questions with genuine interest. One evening, after Tyler had gone home, Alexandra asked James about his military service. He usually avoided talking about it, but something about her quiet curiosity made him open up. He told her about the friends he'd lost, about the guilt he carried for surviving when others didn't, about the nightmares that still woke him up some nights. "How did you keep going?" Alexandra asked. "Tyler, when I came home and everything felt wrong, when I couldn't sleep or think straight, when I wanted to just disappear, I'd think about him. I thought about the man I wanted him to see when he looked at me. That pulled me through the worst days. You're a good father. I'm trying to be. That's all any of us can do, right?" "Just try," Alexandra nodded slowly. "I've spent my whole life trying to be a good CEO, a good businesswoman, a good daughter to a dead father. But I never tried to just be a good person. I never tried to have connections that mattered more than quarterly reports." "It's not too late," James said simply. "Isn't it, though? I'm dying. You're still breathing. That means it's not too late." Something shifted in Alexandra's expression. Determination, maybe. Or the first real spark of hope James had seen in her eyes. The next morning, Alexandra asked for her laptop. James watched as she started writing emails, not to her board of directors or business partners, but to people she'd hurt or pushed away over the years. Employees she'd been cruel to, a college roommate she'd lost touch with 15 years ago, her younger brother she hadn't spoken to in over a decade after an argument about their father's will. She didn't expect responses, but some came anyway. Her brother wrote back within hours asking if they could talk. An employee she'd fired years ago sent a kind message saying there were no hard feelings. The college roommate called, and they talked for an hour about old memories and lost time. James also noticed Alexandra making changes to how she was thinking about Biogen Industries. She started talking about reforming company policies, about creating better benefits for employees, about focusing on medications that helped people, rather than just medications that made money. "I can't undo everything I've done wrong," she told James one evening, "but maybe I can start doing things right while I still have time." Her medical team scheduled a meeting to discuss the transplant list. Alexandra's improvement meant she might now qualify, though the waiting list was years long and there were no guarantees. The surgery would be risky given how sick she'd been. "I want to do it," Alexandra told the doctors. "Whatever it takes, I want to try." James squeezed her hand supportively. The woman he'd met 6 weeks ago wouldn't have fought this hard. She'd given up before the battle even started. But this woman, the one emerging from beneath years of loneliness and pain, was ready to fight. That weekend, Tyler came bounding into her room with his completed science fair project. It was a poster board explaining how the liver worked, complete with hand-drawn diagrams and fun facts written in crayon. "Look, Miss Alexandra, I finished it, and I dedicated it to you because you taught me so much." At the bottom of the poster, in Tyler's careful handwriting, it said, "For Miss Alexandra, who taught me that science is cool and that being sick doesn't mean giving up. I hope you get better soon." Alexandra stared at those words, tears forming in her eyes. In her entire life, with all her accomplishments and awards and magazine covers, nothing had ever meant more to her than a third grader's science fair project dedicated in her honor. "It's perfect." "Tyler," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "it's absolutely perfect." James watched them together, his patient and his son, and realized that healing came in unexpected forms. Sometimes it wasn't the medicine or the procedures that saved someone. Sometimes it was connection, purpose, and the simple act of being seen and valued by another person. Alexandra was still sick. The road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time since James had met her, she looked like someone who wanted to take that journey, whatever challenges it might bring. 3 months had passed since James started working with Alexandra, and the transformation was remarkable. She'd gained back some weight, her skin had lost that yellowish tint, and most importantly, there was light in her eyes again. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, but James knew the truth that Alexandra tried not to think about. Without a transplant, all this progress only bought her time. Maybe a few more months, maybe a year if she was lucky. The waiting list for a liver transplant was impossibly long, and even being on it wasn't a guarantee. Still, James refused to let her spend whatever time she had left in sadness. He'd seen too many people in his life waste their final days drowning in what-ifs and regrets. If Alexandra was going to face this, she was going to do it while actually experiencing life. He started small. One sunny afternoon, he convinced her to go outside for the first time in months. The hospital had a beautiful rooftop garden that most patients never knew existed. James wheeled her up in a wheelchair even though she protested that she could walk. "Save your energy," he'd said. "You're going to need it to argue with Tyler about his science fair presentation later." When they reached the garden, Alexandra closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sun. "I forgot what this felt like," she whispered. "Real sunshine. Fresh air. You've been living in a bubble for too long." "I've been living in a bubble for years, James." The hospital room was just more honest about it. They sat in silence for a while, watching the city move below them. Finally, Alexandra spoke again. "I need to tell you something. I've been working on some changes at Biogen. Big changes." "What kind of changes?" "The kind that'll probably get me voted out by the board if I survive long enough to implement them. I'm restructuring how we compensate employees. Real healthcare benefits, not just the minimum. Paid family leave. Mental health support. Child care assistance for single parents." James looked at her in surprise. "That's going to cost the company a fortune. It's going to cost the company some profit margin. But you know what it'll gain? Actual human beings who don't have to choose between taking care of their kids and keeping their jobs. People who don't have to work themselves to death like I did. The board won't like it. I don't care what the board likes anymore. I spent 38 years caring what everyone thought of me, what my father would think, what investors wanted. I'm done with that. If I'm going to leave this world, I want to leave it better than I found it." Over the following weeks, Alexandra threw herself into this mission with the same intensity she'd once reserved for increasing shareholder value. She met with her executive team, not to discuss profit projections, but to talk about employee welfare. She started a scholarship program for children of single parents, thinking of Tyler and all the kids like him whose parents struggled to provide opportunities. She also established a fund specifically for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. When James found out about it, he'd tried to thank her, but she'd waved him off. "You gave me something more valuable than money could ever buy. You gave me a reason to keep fighting. This is just me trying to pay that forward." James watched her transformation with quiet amazement. The cold, isolated CEO he'd met 3 months ago was gone. In her place was someone who actually cared about the people around her, who asked employees about their families, who remembered names and personal details. But he also noticed something else developing, something he tried to ignore at first. He was falling for her, not because she was wealthy or successful, but because of who she'd become. He admired her courage, her determination to change despite knowing her time was limited. He loved how she listened to Tyler's endless questions with genuine patience. He appreciated how she asked about his custody case and celebrated with him when the judge finally granted him joint custody. He knew it was complicated. She was technically still his patient, even though their relationship had evolved far beyond professional boundaries. And more importantly, she was sick. Getting emotionally attached to someone who might die seemed like a cruel setup for heartbreak. But the heart doesn't listen to logic. One evening, after Tyler had fallen asleep on the couch in Alexandra's suite, James and Alexandra sat talking quietly. They'd been discussing his upcoming custody hearing, the one that would hopefully give him equal time with Tyler instead of just alternating weekends. "You're going to win," Alexandra said confidently. "Any judge who sees you with Tyler can tell you're an amazing father." "I hope you're right. It's cost me everything I had saved, but it's worth it. Speaking of which," Alexandra said carefully, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something. I've set up a trust fund for you and Tyler." James's head snapped up. "Alexandra, no. I'm not taking your money. It's not charity, James. You saved my life, not just medically, but in every way that matters. Before you came, I was just waiting to die. Now I actually want to live. That's worth more than any amount of money. I didn't do this for money. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I know. That's exactly why I want to do this. The fund will cover Tyler's education, all the way through college. And there's enough for you to finish your physician assistant program without having to work full-time." James shook his head. "I can't accept that. You don't have a choice. It's already done." The money's set aside in a trust that opens after I'm gone. Think of it as a thank you for giving me something to care about in my final months." The words "after I'm gone" hung heavy in the air between them. "Don't talk like that," James said quietly. "You're getting stronger every day. The transplant list is years long, and I'm realistic about my chances. But that's okay, James. I'm not afraid anymore. Because of you and Tyler, I got to experience what actually matters in life. Connection, purpose, love." The word love seemed to echo in the quiet room. They sat in silence, both aware that something unspoken had shifted between them. Tyler stirred on the couch, mumbling something about dinosaurs in his sleep. James got up to adjust the blanket around his son, grateful for the distraction, but Alexandra wasn't done. "James, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If something happens to me, promise you'll make sure Tyler knows how much he meant to me. That kid gave me more joy in 3 months than I had in the previous 20 years. "Nothing's going to happen to you," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Promise me anyway." "I promise." Winter settled over the city, and Alexandra's medical team scheduled another round of tests. Her liver function had plateaued. She wasn't getting worse, which was good, but she wasn't improving enough to move up the transplant list significantly. Time was the enemy now, and they were running out of it. Alexandra handled the news with grace that James had come to expect from her. She didn't rage or despair. She simply asked what she could do to improve her chances and then set about doing it with determination. But James saw the fear in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He saw how she held Tyler a little longer when saying goodbye. He noticed how she'd started writing letters and storing them in a folder on her desk. One night, unable to sleep, James walked past her room and saw her light still on. He knocked softly and found her sitting at her desk, writing. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Too much to say, not enough time to say it all," she replied, gesturing to the stack of letters. "I'm writing to people. Employees I want to encourage, my brother, his kids who I barely know, Tyler for when he's older." James sat down across from her. "You're going to be around to tell Tyler these things yourself." "Maybe, but I want to make sure he knows anyway. I want him to know that meeting him changed my life, that his questions and his excitement and his pure heart reminded me what it means to be human." She paused, then pulled out another piece of paper. "I wrote one for you too, Alexandra. I don't read it now." "Read it when?" "If you need to." James took the letter, his throat tight with emotion. He looked at this woman who'd come to mean so much to him, who'd transformed from a bitter, dying stranger into someone he couldn't imagine life without. "I don't want to need this letter," he said quietly. "I don't want you to need it either." They sat in the quiet darkness of her room, both aware that despite all their progress, despite all the hope and fighting and change, some things remained beyond their control. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Alexandra's doctor called early, his voice urgent. "We have a potential match. A liver became available, and you're at the top of the compatible recipient list." Alexandra's hand shook as she held the phone. This was it, the chance they'd been hoping for. But the doctor's next words made her blood run cold. "I need to be honest with you, Alexandra. Given how compromised your health was, the surgery has significant risks. There's a less than 40% chance of survival, but without it you have maybe 3 months left. The choice is yours, 40%, not even half." Alexandra looked at James, who was standing in the doorway having heard everything. She looked at the photo of Tyler on her bedside table, the one from his science fair where he was grinning proudly next to his project. "What do I do?" she whispered. James crossed the room and took her hands in his. "You fight. You fight because Tyler's counting on you to be at his 4th grade graduation. You fight because you have work left to do at Biogen. You fight because I'm not ready to say goodbye to you." His voice broke on the last sentence, and Alexandra realized with sudden clarity what she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. This man, this kind, steady, courageous man had fallen in love with her, and somehow, impossibly, she'd fallen in love with him too. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it. I'll fight." The hours before surgery felt both endless and far too short. Alexandra had signed all the consent forms, listened to all the warnings about the risks, and said goodbye to her brother who'd flown in from across the country. They'd hugged for a long time, both crying, both saying things they should have said years ago. But the hardest goodbye was to Tyler. James had brought him to the hospital that morning, explaining as gently as possible that Miss Alexandra was having a very serious operation. Tyler had listened with wide eyes, clutching his backpack. "Is she going to be okay, Dad?" "The doctors are going to do everything they can, buddy. But it's going to be a long surgery, and we need to be patient." When Tyler walked into Alexandra's pre-op room, he was trying hard to be brave, but his lower lip trembled as he approached her bed. "Hey, scientist," Alexandra said, managing a smile despite her own fear. "Come here." Tyler climbed carefully onto the bed beside her, and Alexandra wrapped her arm around him. "I brought you something," Tyler said, pulling a small plastic astronaut from his backpack. The same one he'd shown her during their first meeting months ago. "It's my good luck astronaut. He's been to space and everything. Well, pretend space, but he's really brave. I want you to have him for your surgery." Alexandra's eyes filled with tears as Tyler pressed the small toy into her hand. "Tyler, this is your favorite." "I can't take this. You're just borrowing him. You have to give him back when you're better, okay? That means you have to get better. The simple logic of an 8-year-old. You have to get better because you promised to return his toy." "Okay," Alexandra whispered, clutching the plastic astronaut. "I promise I'll give him back when I'm better." James watched them together, his heart breaking and swelling at the same time. Whatever happened in that operating room, Alexandra had experienced real love in these final months. She'd connected with people in a way she never had before. That had to count for something. After Tyler left with James's ex-wife, who'd agreed to watch him during the surgery, James returned to Alexandra's room. They had 30 minutes before the surgical team would come to take her down. "I'm scared," Alexandra admitted. It was the first time she'd said it out loud. "I know. I would be too. What if I don't make it, James? What if this is it?" James sat on the edge of her bed and took her hand. "Then you'll go knowing you spent your last months actually living. You made peace with your brother. You changed your company to help thousands of people. You inspired a kid to love science. You taught a stubborn veteran that it's okay to let people in again. I didn't teach you that. You already knew it. You're the one who taught me." They sat in silence for a moment, hands intertwined. "James, I need to tell you something before they take me down. Just in case, don't talk like that, please. Let me say this." She took a shaky breath. "I spent my whole life thinking love was a weakness, that caring about people would distract me from my goals. I was so wrong. Falling in love with you and Tyler gave me a reason to fight. You two are the best thing that ever happened to me." James felt his own eyes burning with tears. "Alexandra, I know it's complicated. I know I'm your patient and I'm sick and this is probably the worst timing in the world. But I needed you to know. Even if I don't make it through this surgery, I needed you to know that you saved me in every way that matters." James leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently. "You're going to make it through this surgery. And when you do, we're going to figure out all the complicated stuff together. You, me, and Tyler. Deal?" "Deal." The surgical team arrived then, a group of efficient nurses and doctors who began preparing Alexandra for transport. James walked beside her gurney all the way to the operating room doors, holding her hand until the last possible moment. "See you on the other side," he said. "See you on the other side," she echoed, still clutching Tyler's plastic astronaut. Then the doors closed, and all James could do was wait. The surgery was supposed to take between 12 and 16 hours. James sat in the waiting room, unable to eat, unable to focus on anything. His ex-wife brought Tyler by after a few hours. The boy immediately curled up next to James, sensing his father's anxiety. "Is Miss Alexandra still in surgery?" "Yeah, buddy. It's going to be a while longer. Can we pray for her, Dad?" James wasn't particularly religious, but he wasn't going to say no to his son. They bowed their heads together in that sterile waiting room, and Tyler said a simple prayer asking God to help the doctors fix Miss Alexandra so she could come to his 4th grade graduation. Hours crawled by. 8 hours. 10 hours. 12 hours. James's brother-in-arms from his army days showed up around hour 14, having driven 3 hours after James had texted him. They sat together without needing to say much the way old soldiers do. At hour 15, one of the surgical nurses came out still in her scrubs. James jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. "She's still in surgery, but I wanted to update you. She's holding her own. It's been complicated, but the transplant team is excellent. Dr. Hayes wanted me to tell you that she's fighting hard. James sank back into his chair, relief washing over him. Still fighting. That was all he could ask for. Another 2 hours passed before the doors finally opened and Dr. Hayes emerged, pulling off his surgical cap. His face was exhausted but not defeated. She made it through, he said, and James felt his knees nearly buckle. The next 72 hours are critical. There's still risk of rejection, infection, complications. But the new liver is functioning and she's stable. Against considerable odds, she made it through. James couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears streaming down his face. The recovery was brutal. Alexandra spent 2 weeks in intensive care, fighting off infections and complications. There were moments when James thought they might lose her despite the successful surgery. But she kept fighting, just like she'd promised. When she finally woke up fully, the first thing she did was look around the room until she found James sitting in the chair beside her bed. "Tyler's astronaut," she whispered through the oxygen mask. "Where is it?" James pulled the small plastic toy from his pocket. He'd been carrying it since the surgery like a talisman. He placed it in her hand and she closed her fingers around it weakly. "Told you I'd give it back," she murmured, then fell back asleep. The months that followed were filled with physical therapy, medication adjustments, and careful monitoring. James stayed by her side through all of it, though they both agreed he should transition from being her nurse to just being her friend, and maybe eventually, something more. Tyler visited constantly, bringing homework to work on in her room, showing her drawings, telling her about everything happening at school. He informed her very seriously that she absolutely had to be at his 4th grade graduation because he was getting an award for his science project. Wouldn't miss it for the world, Alexandra promised. 6 months after the transplant, Alexandra was strong enough to return to work part-time, but she was a different kind of CEO now. She actually left the office at reasonable hours. She attended Tyler's baseball games and school events. She had dinner with her brother's family once a month. She went to therapy regularly. She'd learned that the company would survive without her constant presence, and more importantly, she'd learned that she wanted a life beyond spreadsheets and board meetings. A year after the transplant, Alexandra stood in the audience at Tyler's 4th grade graduation, watching as he received the Presidential Award for Educational Excellence. When he crossed the stage, he looked directly at her and James, grinning that huge gap-toothed smile that could light up a room. After the ceremony, Tyler ran to them, his certificate clutched in his hand. "I did it! Did you see? I got the award." "We're so proud of you, buddy," James said, hugging his son tightly. Tyler looked at Alexandra. "You came. You really came?" "Of course I came. I promised, didn't I?" That evening, the 3 of them celebrated with pizza and ice cream in James and Tyler's apartment. It was simple and perfect, nothing like the fancy restaurants Alexandra used to frequent. As she sat on their worn couch, watching James and Tyler argue, playfully about which superhero was the strongest, she realized she'd finally found what she'd been searching for her entire life. It wasn't in a corner office or on a magazine cover or in a bank account. It was right here in this modest apartment, with these 2 people who'd seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. 2 years after her transplant, on a quiet Sunday morning in early fall, James and Alexandra got married in a small ceremony. Tyler served as best man, wearing a suit that was slightly too big and carrying the rings with serious concentration. Alexandra's brother walked her down the aisle. Her employees, the ones she'd actually gotten to know as people, filled the chairs. It wasn't the kind of wedding anyone would have expected from Alexandra Thornton, CEO of Biogen Industries. There were no celebrities, no business tycoons, no media coverage. Just the people who actually mattered. During their vows, Alexandra looked at James and said, "You gave me a reason to live when I'd forgotten why life was worth living. You taught me that success isn't measured in profit margins, but in the people you love and the lives you touch. You saved me, not just physically, but in every possible way." James smiled, tears in his eyes. "You taught me that it's never too late to start over. That broken people can heal each other. That love shows up in the most unexpected places, usually when we need it most." Tyler, standing beside them, whispered loudly, "Can we have cake now?" The audience laughed, and Alexandra pulled Tyler into their embrace. This was her family now. This was her life. Not the one she'd planned, but the one she'd been given a second chance to build. She'd been a dying CEO who everyone had given up on, including herself. But a single dad veteran and his 8-year-old son had given her something no amount of money could buy: unconditional love and a reason to fight for tomorrow. In the end, that made all the difference.